Hello, everybody. Um, I wanted to bake a cake this morning. But TFT, which is the school of UCLA that I attend, in its infinite wisdom, had decided that students, instead of administrators, should figure out how to schedule their classes. And so there was a big kerfuffle in the student group chat. And then I was like, I will fix this. And then I tried too hard to fix it. And then I had to be like, today, after 3 days of trying really hard to fix it, be like, hello, Steve, administrator of TFT. I'm not an administrator. So you need to figure this out for the students because we signed up for these classes. We deserve to take them. Thank you very much. Good night. So I didn't get to bake my cake. And it's looking unlikely for cake today, but there's always cake tomorrow. It's going to be an orange chiffon cake. I look forward to it. I think someday I will do a live stream of me baking. Not that anyone would be interested in that, but I would. And that's all that matters. Today I have a seltzer water with me because my chaos meal after that massive kerfluffle was a full box of macaroni and cheese and a seltzer water, because last night I drank one of my last two remaining wines after the kerfluffle of yesterday. So I got to conserve because that's my last remaining canned wine, and I don't know what I'm gonna do when they run out. As usual, stalling a little bit, but not too much. So yesterday, I think you're thinking of aqua seltzer. I'm sure it's aqua seltzer. Okay, what happened yesterday? A lot of names happened. Oh, yes! They were gonna have a party. The Walenska Meagit family was gonna have a party. They were like, hey, everybody, come to our party. It's for our cousin Ellen Olenska. And everyone was like, no. And they would not come. The aristocrats would not come to the party because it was going to be for Ellen Olenska, and nobody wanted to meet her because, oh my God, she's a woman and she was in a bad situation and she left, and that's just like, you can't leave a bad situation. So that's why they decided not to come to the party, which is pretty fucking rude. So anyways, glad that I marked this not for kids. Let's see what these little mofos get up to today. All right. The Age of Innocence Chapter 7. Mrs. Henry van der Luyden listened in silence to her cousin Mrs. Archer's narrative. It was all very well to tell yourself in advance that Mrs. van der Luyden was always silent, and that, though non-committal by nature and training, she was very kind to the people she really liked. Excuse me. Even personal experience of these facts was not always a protection from the chill that descended on one in the high-ceilinged, white-walled Madison Avenue drawing room, with the pale brocaded armchairs so obviously uncovered for the occasion, and the gauze still veiling the ormolu mantel ornaments, and the beautiful old carved frame of Gainsborough's Lady Angelica de Lac. Mrs. van der Luyden's portrait by Huntington, in black velvet and Venetian point, faced that of her lovely ancestress. It was generally considered as fine as a Cabanel, and though 20 years had elapsed since its execution, was still a perfect likeness. Indeed, the Mrs. van der Luyden who sat beneath it listening to Mrs. Archer might have been the twin sister of the fair and still youngish woman drooping against a gilt armchair before a green rep curtain. Mrs. van der Luyden still wore black velvet and Venetian point when she went into society, or rather, since she never dined out, when she threw open her own doors to receive it. Her fair hair, which with an was still parted in flat overlapping points on her forehead, and the straight nose that divided her pale blue eyes was only a little more pinched about the nostrils than when the portrait had been painted. She always, indeed, struck Newland Archer as having been rather gruesomely preserved in the airless atmosphere of a perfectly irreproachable existence, as bodies caught in glaciers keep for many years in rosy life and death. Like all his family, he esteemed and admired Mrs. van der Luyden, but he found her gentle bending sweetness less approachable than the grimness of some of his mother's old aunts, fierce spinsters who said no on the principle before they knew what they were going to be asked. I shall first have to talk this over with my husband. She and Mr. van der Luyden were so exactly alike that Archer often how, after 40 years of the close closet conjugality, two such merged identities ever separated themselves enough for anything as controversial as a talking over. But neither had ever reached a decision without preface. I should like Henry to hear what you have told me. A footman appeared, to whom she gravely added, If Mr. van der Luyden has finished reading the newspaper, please ask him to be kind enough to come. She said, reading the newspaper, in the tone in which a minister's wife might have said, presiding at a cabinet meeting, not from any arrogance of mind, but because of the habit of a lifetime, and the attitude of her friends and relations had led her to consider Mr. van der Luyden's least gesture as having an almost sacerdotal importance. Her promptness of action showed that she considered the case as pressing as Mrs. Archer, but lest she should be thought to have committed herself in advance, she added with the sweetest look, Henry always enjoys seeing you, dear Adeline, and he will wish to congratulate Newland. The double doors had solemnly reopened, and between them appeared Mr. Henry van der Luyden, tall, spare, and frock-coated, with faded hair and a straight nose like his wife's, and the same look of frozen gentleness in the eyes that were merely pale grey instead of pale blue. Mr. van der Luyden greeted Mrs. Archer with cousinly affability, proffered to Newland low-voiced congratulations, couched in the same language as his wife's, and seated himself in one of the brocade armchairs with the simplicity of a reigning sovereign. I had just finished reading the Times, he said, laying his long fingertips together. In town my mornings are so much occupied that I find it more convenient to read the newspaper after luncheon. Ah, there's a great deal to be said for that plan. Indeed, I think my Uncle Egmont used to say he found it less agitating not to read the morning papers till after dinner, said Mrs. Archer. Yes, my good father abhorred hurry. But now we live in constant rush, said Mr. van der Luyden, in measured tones, looking with pleasant deliberation about the large shrouded room, which to Archer was so complete an image of its owners. But I hope you had finished your reading, Henry, his wife interposed. Quite, he reassured her. Then I should like Adeline to tell you. Oh, it's really Newland's story, said his mother, smiling, and proceeded to rehearse once more the monstrous tale of the affront inflicted on Mrs. Lovell Mingott. Of course, she ended, Augusta Welland and Mary Mingott both felt that, especially in view of Newland's engagement, you and Henry ought to know. Ah, said Mr. van der Luyden, drawing a deep breath. There was a silence during which the tick of the monumental Ormolu clock on the white marble mantelpiece grew as loud as the boom of a minute gun. Archer contemplated with awe the two slender faded figures, seated side by side in a kind of viceregal rigidity, mouthpieces of some remote ancestral authority which fate compelled them to wield, when they would so much rather have lived in simplicity and seclusion, digging invisible weeds out of the perfect lawns of Skuytercliff, and playing patience together in the evenings. Mr. van der Luyden was the first to speak. You really think this is due to some intentional interference of Lawrence Lefferts? He inquired, turning to Archer. I'm certain of it, sir. Larry has been going it rather harder than usual lately, if Cousin Louisa won't mind my mentioning, having rather a stiff affair with the postmaster's wife in their village, or someone of that sort, and whenever poor Gertrude Lefferts begins to suspect anything and he's afraid of trouble, he gets up a fuss of this kind to show how awfully moral he is, and talks top of his voice about the impertinence of inviting his wife to meet people he doesn't wish her to know. He's simply using Madame Olenska as a lightning rod. I've seen him try the same thing often before. The Leffertses, said Mrs. van der Luyden. "The Leffertses!" echoed Mrs. Archer. "What would Uncle Edmund have said of Lawrence Lefferts pronouncing on anybody's social position? It shows what society has come to." "Well, I hope it has not quite come to that," said Mr. van der Luyden firmly. "Ah, if only you and Louisa went out more," sighed Mrs. Archer. But instantly she became aware of her mistake. The van der Luydens were morbidly sensitive to any criticism of their secluded existence. They were the arbiters of fashion, the court of last appeal, and they knew it, and bowed to their fate. But being shy and retiring persons with no natural inclination for their part, they lived as much as possible in the sylvan solitude of Skuytercliff, and when they came to town, declined all invitations on the plea of Mrs. van der Luyden's health. Newland Archer came to his mother's rescue. "Everybody in New York knows what you and your cousin Louisa represent. That's why Mrs. Mingott felt she ought not to allow this slight on Countess Olenska to pass without consulting you." Mrs. van der Luyden glanced at her husband, who glanced back at her. "It's the principle that I dislike," said Mr. van der Luyden. "As long as a member of a well-known family is backed up by that family, it should be considered final." "It seems so to me," said his wife, as if she were producing a new idea. "I had no idea," Mr. van der Luyden continued, "that things had come to such a pass." He paused and looked at his wife again. "It occurs to me, my dear, that the Countess Olenska is already a sort of relation, through Medora Manson's first husband. At any rate, she will be when Newland marries." He turned toward the young man. "Have you read this morning's Times, Newland?" "Why, yes, sir," said Archer, who usually tossed off a half-dozen papers with his morning coffee. Husband and wife looked at each other again. Their pale eyes clung together in prolonged and serious consultation. Then a faint smile fluttered over Mrs. van der Luyden's face. She had evidently guessed and approved. Mr. van der Luyden turned to Mrs. Archer. "If Louisa's health allowed her to dine out, I wish you would say to Mrs. Lovell Mingott. She and I would have been happy to fill the places of the Lawrence Lefferts at her dinner." He paused to let the irony of this sink in. "As you know, it is impossible. That is impossible." Mrs. Archer sounded a sympathetic assent. Who the heck is speaking right now? I think it must be Mrs. Archer. "But Newland tells me he has read this morning's Times. Therefore, he has probably seen that Louisa's relative, the Duke of St. Austria, arrives next week on the Russia. He is coming to enter his new slope, the Guinevere, in next summer's International Cup race." Oh, damn, this was all it was Mr. van der Luyden after all. "He is coming to enter his new slope, the Guinevere, in next summer's International Cup race, and also to have a little canvasback shooting at Trevenna." Mr. van der Luyden paused again and continued with increasing benevolence. "Before taking him down to Maryland, we are inviting a few friends to meet him there. Only a little dinner, with a reception afterwards. I am sure Louisa will be as glad as I am if Countess Olenska will let us include her among our guests." He got up, bent his long body with a stiff friendliness towards his cousin, and then added, "I think I have Louisa's authority for saying that if she will leave her, that she will leave herself the invitation to dine when she drives out, presently, with our cards, of course, with our cards." Mrs. Archer, who knew this to be a hint at the 17-hand chestnuts, which were never kept waiting, were at the door, rose with a hurried murmur of thanks. Mrs. van der Luyden beamed on her with the smile of Esther interceding with Ahasuerus. But her husband raised a protesting hand. "There is nothing to thank me for, dear Adeline, nothing whatever. This kind of thing must not happen in New York. It shall not, as long as I can help it," he pronounced with sovereign gentleness as he steered his cousins to the door. 2 hours later, everyone knew that the great sea-spring barouche, in which Mrs. van der Luyden took the air at all seasons, had been seen at old Mrs. Mingott's door, where a large square envelope was handed in, and that evening at the opera, Mr. Sillerton Jackson was able to state that the envelope contained a card inviting the Countess Olenska to the dinner which the van der Luydens were giving the following week for their cousin, the Duke of St. Austrey. Some of the younger men in the club box exchanged a smile at this announcement and glanced sideways at Lawrence Lefferts, who sat carelessly in the front of the box, pulling his long, fair mustache, and who remarked with authority, as the soprano paused, "No one but Patty ought to attempt the Sonnambula." And with that phrase, which I have no idea which means, that's the end of, where did I throw my bookmark? That's the end of chapter 7. Tomorrow will be, drumroll please, chapter 8. I really don't know where my bookmark. There it is. It's on the floor. So with that, tomorrow, maybe I'll bring a slice of cake up to show you before, but I will probably be. I'm gonna pick up my bookmark. I'll probably be not live streaming it, but live picturing it on my Instagram if you wanted to see that. Of course, I'm just offering this as fun. I'm not trying to like get 8,000 followers or anything. I just want to do something, and it's funner when people interact. Yes, there's always cake tomorrow. Maybe I'll get that tattooed somewhere. So with that, thank you, wonderful people. I can't wait to read through all your little comments. I never know exactly when they refer to, but I always assume that you're having a fun time. All right. With that, I will I've said with that like 400 times at this point, so I'm just going to end it. Have a great rest of your evening. I wish you all easy and fun things to find to do. I love words. Good night.